There is a version of you that other people are quietly rooting against, not loudly, not obviously. They would never say it. Some of them may not even consciously know it themselves. But it's there in the slight pause before they congratulate you, in the way their eyes move when you mention something going well, in the specific quality of their silence, when your name comes up in a room they thought you weren't in. Most people live their entire lives without noticing this. And that's not because they're foolish. It's because they were never taught to look for it. They were taught to trust, to be open, to believe that vulnerability is strength and that sharing everything is intimacy. And sometimes those things are true. But sometimes in the wrong places with the wrong people, at the wrong moment, those instincts are the most expensive mistakes you will ever make. Niccolo Machiavelli spent his life watching people destroy themselves, not through laziness, not through stupidity, through misplaced trust, through emotional impulsiveness, through entering rooms, psychological rooms, strategic rooms, relational rooms, that they never should have stepped into. He watched brilliant men collapse, capable leaders fall. Talented individuals spend decades wondering why nothing ever seemed to work out, while the answer sat quietly in plain sight. What you're about to hear isn't theory. It's pattern recognition drawn from centuries of human behavior, from leaders who survived and from those who didn't, from the psychology of ambition, the mechanics of betrayal, and the slow, quiet costs of entering spaces you were never equipped to navigate. Drive. There are 7 of them, 7 dangerous places, not physical, psychological, strategic, emotional. And the frightening thing isn't that they're hard to find. The frightening thing is how familiar they feel when you step inside. One, it begins innocuously enough. Someone misunderstands you, or they don't misunderstand you. They simply choose an interpretation of your actions that serves their narrative better than the truth does. And something rises in you, a reasonable human impulse, the desire to correct the record, to explain, to be understood. So you talk, you clarify, you lay out your reasoning carefully, methodically, with evidence. You expect that once they hear the full picture, the conversation will shift, the misunderstanding will dissolve, the relationship will be restored. The relationship will be restored. And sometimes, in honest exchanges with people genuinely seeking understanding, that's exactly what happens. But there is a different category of person, and they look identical from the outside. They nod in the same places. They use the same language of openness, but they are not listening to understand. They are listening to catalog. Every explanation you offer becomes ammunition. Every clarification becomes confirmation of what they already believed, because their belief was never based on evidence, and so evidence will never dislodge it. Machiavelli observed something about human nature that still holds with uncomfortable precision. A man convinced against his will holds his original opinion still. Not because people are unintelligent, because most people's opinions about other people are not rational constructions. They are emotional ones. They are built from envy, from past wounds, from the need to have someone to position themselves against. And logical dismantling of an emotional structure doesn't work. It never has. The cost of entering this place, of choosing to explain yourself to those who have already decided, is not just wasted time. It's worse. Every time you explain, you signal that their judgment has power over you. You legitimize the tribunal. You step into the dock voluntarily, and by doing so, you give the courtroom its authority. The dignified move, the strategically correct move, is to refuse to appear. This doesn't mean becoming cold. It doesn't mean refusing all accountability. There is a world of difference between genuine accountability to people whose judgment you respect and whose relationship you value, and performative self-defense in front of an audience that has already written the ending. Learn to feel the difference. It lives in your body before it arrives in your mind. When the explanation you're forming feels desperate rather than honest, when what you're doing is managing their perception rather than sharing your truth, stop. Leave that room. Close the door quietly behind you. The right people don't require you to campaign for their understanding. And the wrong ones won't be moved by your campaign anyway. Your silence in those moments is not surrender. It is the highest form of strategic dignity. It says, your assessment of me is not my concern. And that message, delivered without words, is the only one that ever lands. 2. This one is subtle. Dangerously subtle. You notice someone, maybe it's a colleague, maybe it's someone you follow online, someone adjacent to your field, someone from your past who has chosen the same road you're on. And without any declaration, without any formal agreement, a competition begins. In your head, in your energy, in the quiet architecture of your daily decisions. You check their progress more than you should. You feel something strange when they succeed. Not quite pain, not quite joy, something in between that you don't have a clean word for. You begin making decisions not based on what you want to build, but based on what you want to surpass. Here is the danger they never warned you about. You can lose a race that was never real. When you enter invisible competition, competition that exists only in your psychology, you hand your direction over to someone else's momentum. You stop building toward your vision and start building in reaction to their movement. Your output is no longer a reflection of your values. It's a countermove. And countermoves, even brilliant ones, are fundamentally defensive. They are reactive. And reactive men do not build lasting things. The historical record is full of this pattern. Leaders who spent their energy tracking rivals instead of developing their own foundations. Brilliant individuals who matched every move their competition made, and in doing so, became a shadow of someone else's original. What Machiavelli understood, what the Stoics understood, what every serious student of power eventually discovers, is that the greatest strategic advantage available to a person is sustained, focused, internally directed effort. The man who is building without looking sideways covers more ground than the man who is measuring his position against others every 3 steps. There's another layer here too. When you compete with someone who doesn't know it, you tend to behave in ways that are slightly off, slightly performative, because you're not building for your audience or your vision anymore. You're building for an audience of one person who isn't even watching. And that distortion leaks into your work, into your relationships, into your decisions. The exit from this place is not arrogance. It's not pretending other people don't exist, or that their success is irrelevant. The exit is a return to your own coordinates, a quiet, daily recommitment to the question, what am I actually building? And does this decision serve that? If the honest answer is that a given action is primarily about closing a gap between you and someone else, pause. That's the signal. You've stepped into the wrong room again. 3. This is one of the most seductive traps available to an ambitious person, because it feels like wisdom. It feels like seeking counsel. It feels in the moment like vulnerability, and we have been told that vulnerability is courageous. But there's a version of sharing strategy that isn't vulnerability, it's something else entirely. It's audition, it's seeking permission. It's laying your plans on the table and watching to see if the people across from you flinch, and then recalibrating your own belief based on their reaction. People do this constantly. They share their ambitions prematurely. They speak their plans into the air before those plans have had time to solidify, before they have roots, before they have the kind of internal clarity that can survive external skepticism. And then they wonder why their momentum died. Here's what happens in that room. You share something you're building, something genuinely important to you, something that requires resources and focus and belief. And the people you share it with, even the ones who love you, process that information through their own filters, their own fears, their own sense of what's possible, their own unconscious assessments of what you deserve, and they respond. Sometimes the response is enthusiastic, sometimes it's measured, sometimes it's subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a non-committal nod, a question that implies you may have overlooked something obvious, and you absorb it, even if you don't mean to. Even if you intellectually disagree with every skeptic in the room, You absorb it in your body, and it lives there, and it starts doing quiet work. Plans shared too early die of exposure, not always because the people you shared them with are malicious. Sometimes because they're simply limited by their imagination, by their own path, by the honest fact that they cannot see what you see. And you are asking them to validate a vision they don't yet have access to. Machiavelli was precise about this. The strength of an action depends partly on how long it stays protected. Not forever. Eventually, execution requires others, requires resources, requires visibility. But in the early stages, a plan is like a plant that hasn't rooted yet. Sunlight at the wrong moment can burn it. Not because sunlight is bad, because timing matters. There's also a strategic dimension beyond the personal. When you reveal your intentions, you give others time to respond, to adjust, to position, to quietly work against you if they choose. Not out of conspiracy, but out of ordinary self-interest. People instinctively protect their current arrangements. If your plan disrupts that arrangement, they will, consciously or unconsciously, find reasons to slow you down. Hold your plans, not out of distrust, not out of paranoia, out of respect for the work. Let them become real before you let the world have opinions about them. 4. There is a room that many people return to their entire lives, long after they've outgrown it. It's the room where the original authorities lived. A parent, a mentor, an early peer group. An institution that once defined what success meant. And even after you've built something they never built, even after you've gone further than their framework accounted for, something in you keeps going back, keeps wanting their recognition, keeps feeling, in some complicated ancient part of your psychology, that their approval would finally make the achievement real. This isn't weakness. It's human. It's the long shadow of early formation, the way the people and structures that shaped our earliest sense of worth don't simply dissolve when we outgrow them. They linger. They exert gravitational pull, and we mistake that pull for legitimate authority. But here is what that pull costs. Every hour you spend seeking recognition from someone whose ceiling is lower than your floor is an hour you could have spent building. Every emotional resource you burn on the hope that they'll finally see it, finally acknowledge the distance you've covered, is a resource diverted from the actual work. And perhaps most insidiously, every time you orient yourself toward their approval, you unconsciously shrink your vision to something they can comprehend. You start making decisions that fit their framework rather than your own. You self-censor. You sand down the edges of your ambition to make it more legible to people who are measuring with instruments calibrated for a different scale. The leaders in history who built lasting things shared something in common. At some point, they stopped auditing themselves through the eyes of their origin context. They developed, slowly, sometimes painfully, the capacity to be their own witness, to assess their decisions not against what the old authorities would have sanctioned, but against the internal standard they had developed through their own experience. That shift is one of the most difficult things a person can accomplish, because it requires tolerating a particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of being in territory where no one who knew your beginning can follow you. And the mind, which is wired for belonging, interprets that loneliness as danger. It pulls you back toward the familiar framework, toward the familiar faces, toward the old room. Recognize the pull. Feel it honestly. And then walk in the other direction, not with contempt, but with clarity. The people who shaped your beginning gave you what they had. That gift doesn't require you to stay at the level it was given. Honoring your formation is not the same as being confined by it. 5. There is a specific quality to the thinking that happens in the middle of a strong emotion. It feels clarified. It feels decisive. When you are angry, the path forward seems obvious. When you are afraid, the threat is vivid and immediate. When you are elated, everything appears possible, and the details seem manageable. Emotion creates a kind of focus, and that focus can feel, in the moment, like wisdom. It almost never is. Machiavelli, for all his reputation as a cold analyst, was actually deeply interested in the relationship between feeling and judgment. He watched rulers act from passion and lose provinces. He watched men sacrifice decades of careful positioning in a single emotionally driven moment. He understood something that behavioral science has confirmed in the centuries since, that when you are in a heightened emotional state, you are not thinking more clearly. You are thinking more narrowly. You are running a simplified version of your own cognition, optimized for immediate response, stripped of the nuance and long-term consideration that actual strategic clarity requires. The place this becomes dangerous isn't in obvious emotional crises. Most people know not to send the email when they're in the middle of a rage spiral. The danger is in the subtler versions. The conversation you have when you're just slightly offended. The decision you make when you're just mildly anxious. The commitment you give when you're feeling particularly expansive and generous. These are not full emotional storms. They're weather systems. And they still distort your judgment enough to matter. There's a practice that the Stoics described in different language than we use now, but the core was the same. Create distance between the stimulus and the response. Not coldness, not suppression, not the kind of emotional control that's really just emotional avoidance. True distance, the capacity to observe your emotional state as information rather than instruction. To ask, when the feeling is strong, what would I think about this in 3 days? In 6 months? What would the version of me who has slept on this, who has allowed the intensity to settle, decide? That version of you has access to something the inflamed version doesn't. Pattern recognition across time. The ability to weigh this moment against other moments like it. The ability to see that what feels urgent often isn't, and what feels obvious often has layers you'll only see when the emotion recedes. This doesn't mean waiting forever. Decisiveness matters. There are moments that require immediate action, and hesitation in those moments is its own kind of failure. But those moments are rarer than the emotional state wants you to believe. Most decisions that feel urgent are not. And the cost of acting prematurely from a place of emotional intensity is often asymmetric, quick to do, slow to undo. Stay out of that room. When you feel the pull to decide, to confront, to commit, to speak, and the feeling is strong, note the strength. Let it be data, not command. The room will still be there when you've returned to yourself. Walk in then. 6. There is a version of loyalty that is one of the most admirable qualities a person can possess. It is the loyalty that persists through difficulty, that doesn't dissolve when the person you're loyal to stops being convenient, that holds firm when walking away would be easier, and no one would blame you for it. That loyalty is rare. It is worth protecting. And then there is its shadow, the loyalty that is really just the accumulated weight of history pressing down on a present moment that no longer justifies the cost. The loyalty that continues not out of genuine alignment, but out of the fear of what leaving would mean about you, about the relationship, about who you are as a person. Obligation, disguised as loyalty, is one of the most effective traps in human social life. It works because it speaks in the language of virtue. It says, you can't leave now, after everything. It says, after all they did for you. It says, what kind of person abandons someone who was there when it mattered? And those questions can be legitimate. Genuine gratitude is a value. Historical relationship has weight. But there is a point at which those questions shift from moral guidance to psychological coercion, a point at which the relationship they're protecting no longer exists in the form that made the original loyalty meaningful. Machiavelli's observers of power noticed this dynamic at every level of human organization. The advisor who stayed too long, out of obligation and watched his own relevance, slowly absorbed the dysfunction of the institution he couldn't bring himself to leave. The leader who maintained alliances past the point of usefulness because the original relationship had been important and the end felt like betrayal. The individual who remained in a friendship, a partnership, a situation that had long since stopped serving either party because loyalty, somewhere along the way, had calcified into obligation, and obligation had become its own kind of trap. The question is not whether to be loyal. The question is whether the thing you're being loyal to still exists. Because sometimes what you are protecting is not a relationship. It is a memory of one, and the continued investment in that memory comes at the cost of present tense reality. This requires a kind of honest inventory that most people avoid because the findings are uncomfortable. Ask yourself, if this relationship began today, without the history, without the accumulated weight, would I choose to be here? Not because novelty is the standard, but because the answer tells you something about whether what you're maintaining is genuine loyalty or historical obligation dressed in loyalty's clothing. The exit from this room is not abandonment, it is honest assessment. Sometimes the assessment confirms the loyalty is real and the relationship is worth the investment. But sometimes, often, it reveals that what you've been protecting is a version of the past, and the most honest thing you can do for both parties is to name that clearly and make a clean decision.